Hi everyone, it's Andy here. I'm sorry to say there's no funny joke intro this week. As some of you know, there have been some rumors and accusations about me swirling on social media, and I wanted to take a moment here at the top of the show to address them head on and apologize for my actions. I've actually written a statement I'd like to read because I want to make sure I do this properly. Here we go. To all of my fans and listeners of Lucky Paper Radio, I am so sorry. I have made a severe and continuous lapse in my judgment. I don't expect to be forgiven, I just want to apologize. Recently, I made a remark on this podcast that was thoughtless and hurtful. I deeply regret the words I used. They were inappropriate and offensive, and there is absolutely no excuse. I want to thank those of you who reached out to me to hold me accountable. Your anger and hurt is valid. I betrayed your trust, and I failed to uphold the values of this show. When I said I didn't think corgis were shepherds, I was wrong. The breed, in fact, has a rich heritage as a herding animal. I was wholly incorrect when I said, quote, their stubby little garbage legs aren't even sufficient for herding turtles. They are, in fact, capable livestock herding animals. I was also mistaken in saying, those little loaves of bread would just get trampled if they ever tried to herd a real animal. In fact, the corgi's low, efficient build allows them to nip at the legs of sheep and goats without having to bend over. Please know this apology is just the beginning. I'm committed to making amends and doing better moving forward. I am listening. I am learning. Podcast is just radio, but on the internet. All right. You ready to go then?
Let's go. Let's do it.
Great. Well, in that case, I'm going to welcome everybody to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and for the first time ever, I am not here with my trusty co-host, Anthony, who's taking the week off because we're here with two buddies from the local play group discussing a full vintage roto, two full vintage rotos actually that we did that Anthony did not participate in because it's not really Anthony's vibe. So I'm here with Aran, the soul of Anthony Maddox Teeling.
Wow, those are some big shoes to fill. I was not ready for that, but I'll do my best here.
And also Alex, the spirit of Anthony Maddox.
Oh, okay.
Ren.
Okay. It takes two of us to make one Anthony. I'm fine with that. We just need the body, right?
Who's the body? Yeah. we need the...
Sadie, get in here.
It's not called the trifecta. What's it called in Christianity? The
Holy Trinity.
Holy Trinity, thank you. See, it's been too long since I've been in
I think
church.
it's called the Triforce.
The Triforce. The Jesus Triforce.
The three-body problem.
Anyway, full vintage roto. This is a thing that I had heard of people doing before, and then playing the games on Magic Online if you have Magic Online, because it's convenient to just be able to build the decks. But we're talking about doing a rotisserie draft, which, for those that are listening that have never heard of a rotisserie draft, this is something you usually do with a cube, and basically you just make a spreadsheet, or you use the spreadsheet that Anthony made so skillfully and shares on our website, and you can basically just, get any number of people together. You can actually do it with however many you want, but, 8 people ideally, and you just take picks as if you were like drafting basketball players, right? Just one at a time. You're just going to each take a pick. Everyone can see what everyone else picked, and you just kind of snake your way through the entire cube. It's a really fun way to like play asynchronously. The draft becomes a huge part of the fun. You just end up talking trash in Discord with your friends for up to 2 weeks, depending on how long people take between picks, and then you have decks at the end you can play. So what we did instead of doing this with a cube was just doing this with the full vintage card pool. So every card legal in vintage, which was only possible because, Aran, you graciously, you have a vintage cube already, which, there's a decent overlap between cards in a powerful vintage cube and cards that end up drafted in a full vintage roto. But you were also graciously willing to help proxy whatever people drafted that wasn't already in your cube to make this happen in paper. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I think each time I only had to print out maybe 20, 25 cards or so. So if anyone is listening and thinks that this might be something you're into and you have a vintage cube already in your group, it might not be as big of a setup cost as you might be thinking upon hearing that we're choosing from the full vintage card pool.
Although maybe we're just doing it wrong, and actually the right decks would include way more cards not found in the average vintage cube, and we're just not drafting those decks. Who knows? So I think we should just talk about our experience doing this, because I thought it was really fun and really interesting, and I think quite different from a roto draft of even a powerful vintage cube.
Absolutely.
So we have 2 drafts that we each did. Where do you want to start? Maybe just let's just start with Aran, maybe. And Aran, you can give us your drafts from each of the drafts and just tell us how your draft went, what you were thinking, what you ended up doing.
Sure. So for the first draft, I basically drafted Mishra's Workshop Artifact Aggro. And my impression from the first draft is mostly just feeling overwhelmed because I am...
It's a very overwhelming kind of draft.
Yeah, I thought I was ready, and then I started thinking about the entire card pool of Magic and realized that there were so many cards that I just, I was especially watching some of the drafters in that who are more experienced and knowledgeable about the whole kind of depth of Magic, and seeing especially the sideboard cards that everyone else was taking really drove that home for me. But I knew that I liked artifacts, and I figured that generating lots of mana was going to be important. And so that was kind of what was informing my first few picks. And then I think I just Googled the constructed vintage metagame and saw that Mishra's Workshop was a deck and kind of went from there. Then in the second draft, I was starting off with the brilliant idea that no one would draft Reanimator because no one drafted Reanimator in the first draft that we did.
Yeah, we did notice that Reanimator just went completely ignored in the first draft. And we can talk more about why maybe, but yeah talk about how the second draft went for you first.
So my logic from the first draft was that, and for this one, was that Reanimator would be powerful, but maybe people were loath to draft it because of the plethora of sideboard hate cards for it. And so I was thinking, well, I don't think people are going to draft it, and maybe if I can get all the pieces, I can just make it so powerful that it can go over the top of people's hate cards. And then I was kind of setting up for it, and then right in another row, 3 people took Entomb, Reanimate, and something Grief. Yeah.
That was me.
And yes. And so I just got kind of snaked 3 picks in a row the round before I was going to start taking those cards. So I then audibled into kind of black-white hate bear initiative creatures powered by Mana Crypt. And that's where I ended up with the second draft.
Yeah, we got to the 8th round before anybody took White Pool Adventure, and that was you. And I think that was correct to basically just recognize that that was open and a ridiculously powerful strategy. Before we talk records, let's find out what Alex did in each of these drafts. So your first full vintage roto, what did you get up to?
So I relied on my only eternal experience at all, which was about 3 months of Legacy in the early 2000s, right after Legacy had been created.
Surely nothing's changed since then.
It was really in between. It was like I want to play Magic again, and I hadn't discovered Cube yet. And so I threw myself into Legacy on a website called The Source, and there was this guy who had come up with, he was waiting for this format to happen, and he had come up with a deck based around the card Sea Drake. And Sea Drake is 2 and a blue for a 4/3 flyer, and when it comes into play, it bounces 2 target lands of yours back to your hand. So he had come up with the mana base of, if I play 4 Chrome Moxes and 4 Mox Diamonds and 4 Ancient Tombs and 4 City of Traders, I can start most of my games on 3 mana, and also this ability fizzles. And so I sort of helped him a little bit, very little, kind of playtest and develop that. And then I moved that development into some other colors, into red with Dragon Stompy, with that Hellbent Dragon and all sorts of stuff. But I did know, I was like, okay, so even outside the fast mana that I think we're all thinking of, the Power 9, there are some other ways to get ahead. And so I didn't really know the combos. I didn't really know what a full, was there going to be dredge? But I did know that, hate bears was a thing. I can play hate bears because you don't really have too much to think about. You can turn sideways. You just play them out there and they do their thing automatically. And so I decided to do that. And I was just like, okay, the key to this is if I get one of the first 3 picks, then I'll get Mana Crypt or Soul Ring, and that will be it. And I pulled it up, and we randomized it, and I got the last pick.
Mana Crypt's still available,
and then
though.
Mana Crypt fell to me, and I was so excited.
Yeah, looking back on that now, especially after playing Mana Crypt was my first pick in the second draft, and I first picked Soul Ring in the first one, and partially because of seeing how well Mana Crypt performed in your deck, I was like, I think I just need to take this if I don't get Lotus or Time Walk, which were the first 2 picks.
Yeah, the life never came close to mattering once, so it's just
Yeah.
a soul ring that costs 0.
Yeah.
And then, so I did pretty well, and then the second draft, I also had the last pick, or I had the second to last pick.
Oh, yeah, you were late in their order both times.
And so, but this time Mana Crypt and Soul Ring were gone, so I just grabbed 2 Moxes, and I just decided those were going to be the colors I played. And so I had also been like, oh, Reanimator and Black was underdrafted, so I kind of went into that realm, but Reanimator got snaked from me, so I ended up in kind of more of a discard disruption, back-ended into a tinker because I just thought it hadn't gone and it was like just good value at that point. And so I had the kind of 2 different combos to finish with tinker, and then I also drafted the like Helm of Obedience combo. So I could win through, disruption and grief and creatures, or I could tinker for Blightsteel or Bolas's Citadel, or I could just combo out.
Yeah, you had the winningest record in this second Roto draft, and I gotta say, your deck is like, it's a potpourri. There's a lot of things going on. You're playing the classic Dark Confidant Blightsteel Colossus deck, which you didn't get got by that at any point, I understand, right?
I did not, thankfully, and I had the reverse of that, which is I had the Caustic Bronco, and I had Enlightened Tutor, and my dream was going to be to saddle that
You
bad
can't
boy.
crew a horse. That's rude.
Well, the horse sure can throw a Blightsteel Colossus at you.
But you didn't get to do that
I
either?
did not get to do that, unfortunately.
How many times did you Helm of Obedience someone out?
So 0. But technically, it depends on what your definition is, because I did win versus the Reanimator player by Helm of Obediencing fairly into Atraxa.
Okay,
So,
sure.
So I just turned my 4-mana artifact into an Atraxa and grabbed it from him. So that was pretty sweet.
I wouldn't have guessed that would have come up, but there you go.
I had to explain to everyone watching what Helm of Obedience did, because everyone just knows it as the combo piece and not. I played through Alliances or whenever it came out, so I remember it just being a weird card.
So my first full vintage Roto, I first picked Ancestral Recall, then took Library of Alexandria Mystical Tutor. And at this point I was like, I don't know what people are going to be trying to do. This is the first time any of us have done this kind of draft. I was like, I feel like it'd be easiest for me to just play a control deck and just stop everybody, right? Like, don't try and go for my own broken combo or whatever. Just, you play control cards. There's a long, deep well of 2-mana counter spells and whatever. And then, we've talked about getting cut on things. Then the next round, before it got back to me, Allison, curse you, Allison, took both Force of Will and Force of Negation. Force of Will specifically felt like it was pretty important for me to have, and also kind of signaled that she might be going into a somewhat controlling build, even though she first picked 2 Moxes, which I would not rate very highly in a control deck personally. Anyway, I was thrown a little bit for it. I thought that from everyone else's first picks, no one else was really shaping up to be a control deck. So at that point, I gave up on the control thing and just kind of took good cards, and eventually got towards the very end of the draft and realized that red was just open. Like, I still think that if anybody wanted to do it, they could probably just sit down to one of these full vintage Rotos and just take burn cards and just probably win. This comes back to the question you raised earlier, Aaron, about like, everyone's deck lists are open. How potent can people's sideboard cards be if they know they have a dedicated burn player? People just main deck Life Gain, they main deck things that give themselves Shroud, they, main deck things that just that deck can't deal with or are huge silver bullets against it. I think we were all a little afraid of that, but sitting here today, I'm not sure how much that is actually realistic.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about burn specifically, but I think all of the decks suffered that had a very narrow game plan because sideboard cards are so much better than they would be in a cube. To my knowledge, even vintage cubes don't run Leyline of the Void as a sideboard card, right? Because it's just like, oh, you have to remove this or your game is over, And so and the other thing is everyone gets a stab at, the best hate card left for your deck. And I think that really, the other thing is that really impacts how many lands you want to draft, because those 45 cards can all be very, very impactful because everybody's deck list and how to get them.
You say that. I realized I got to the end of both of these drafts, and at the end of both, I was like, I definitely have sideboard cards I never brought in any of my matches, and that is bad. The deck lists were open. I should have not taken cards I wasn't going to bring in, but it happened to me both times. So, skill issue, I guess. Got to get good.
My impression of this was that if, for example, all 8 of us were very experienced pro players, that these decks would look pretty substantially different in the sideboard portion. I actually think that maybe something like a burn deck, based on the 2 that we did, I think something like a burn deck could have maybe gotten there.
I think so.
I think the sideboard plans for each deck ended up being very dependent on how people felt like their main deck was progressing and how many slots they could afford to allocate to sideboard versus dual land versus kind of what they wanted their main deck engine to be. So I could see if everyone completing this was a very experienced and knowledgeable player, that the sideboard plan would be probably a lot more stressful, maybe, and also a lot more effective than I think it was in our drafts. I had this second draft, I actually used almost every card in my sideboard. I had one pick that I just abandoned completely because I was kind of setting up for the reanimator plan and then didn't get there. But otherwise, I used every card in my sideboard at some point, and that felt to me like the biggest progression personally between the first and the second draft. But overall, to your point, Andy, I think we probably didn't optimally sideboard as well as we could have collectively. That's my sense.
I also just think the silver bullet sideboard plan, and this really highlights my lack of experience in constructed. I think a constructed player specifically would have a much better insight into how to draft this style of deck, maybe, because I mean, even if you do commit a whole pick or even 2 to one matchup, again, 45 picks really felt tight here. You have all the non-basic lands in history to pull from, so you can play tons of them if you want. But to commit a pick or 2 to a specific matchup silver bullet card, if you don't have a tutor, you're still pretty low chances to draw one of those cards on a turn that matters. And I think that overall these games felt a little bit jankier than I expected for the most part. Now, some people's decks in certain games really just, performed really well. We'll get to the second draft in a second, Aaron, but you and I, our matchup was just taking turns, blowing each other out, and then it just kind of all came down to who drew the right cards in the right order, and it was decisively over by turn 3 every single game, basically. But I think there's a lot of games that just kind of dragged on, and people were top decking, and it was this is kind of clunky. It's just not like everyone's deck is super efficient. And it's all those games where it's just any burn deck that can just, count to 20 and your opponent's done for. Seems like it'd be pretty good.
I think Hate Bears would be good against that if you had Chalice, Trinisphere, and any sort of, even if you just have a few lifelinkers. I think that would be tough. Because you also have creatures that burn probably has to take care of if they're taxing your burn.
Well, that's the thing, is I think those kinds of sideboard plans are much more viable, where it's here's a card I'm happy to play main deck that also gives me a substantial edge in a matchup, as opposed to here's whatever leyline makes you have Shroud, and then you just can't be burned by any spells, and also the red deck can't revere enchantment, so it's just over.
Or is there a Boil? No, Boil's for islands, right? But there's something for mountains and they don't untap or something.
Yeah, there's all kinds of weird color hate cards from back in the day.
And then there are just combo decks that don't have creatures, so they can't, and they're will you kill them before they go off is, I think, a pretty good question if you're playing burn.
Yeah.
I don't know when a burn deck wins, just with all the best burn spells, is it turn 5 or whatever?
Yeah, I don't know either. I'd actually be curious to see. But in this first draft, I definitely was drafting with this sideboard plan in mind. The third pick Mystical Tutor, I was thinking I'll be a control deck. This will allow me to get whatever key answer I need for the matchup, and deck lists are open, so I'll know what I'm playing against and be able to sort of plan accordingly. I ended up, because red was wide open, because no one wanted to play any kind of burn spells, I took Lightning Bolt round 19, which, obviously Lightning Bolt's probably top 4 or 5 cards for a aggressive red deck, so nobody was playing aggressive red in this pot at all. But I was definitely thinking about sideboard cards specifically, so I ended up in kind of a Delver-style tempo deck. I leaned into this in pick 18 when I got Dreadhorde Arcanist. That's when I took the Lightning Bolt and was I will take the red burn spells no one else wants.
Right.
But I also took very highly Meltdown, Steel Sabotage, Dress Down, Pyroblast and Red Blast. I took 28th and 29th, which might not sound super high, but that's before I took Dragon's Rage Channeler or Counterspell or Chain Lightning. I took those cards really highly because of the way this pod looked. There were a lot of blue players, there were a lot of artifacts, and I could say from having played the matches out that those 3 cards, Meltdown and the 2 Red Blasts, were key to the deck's success.
I honestly think maybe the number one thing I took away from the first experience into the second one was don't rely too heavily on artifacts. The artifact hate seemed very good, and it just seemed like an uphill battle for, I think we had kind of 2 artifact players in the first draft. And it just seemed very, very difficult despite the seemingly advantages of those broken lands they can draft.
Yeah, I would say there were even a couple more. I mean, there was definitely like, Aran, you were like an artifact deck. You had the workshop. And James had Tolarian Academy and was like a different artifact deck. He went like a Karn the Great Creator route, and you went more
Time
like
Vault,
an aggro.
yeah.
But there was like a lot of artifacts in other people's decks. Like, Alex, you had a ton of artifacts in your deck. Like, I was very happy to have my Meltdown still in the main deck, even though you were playing like a Hate Bear strategy, because you had Mana Crypt, Mox Pearl, Mox Diamond, Crow Mox, Null Rod, which doesn't actually affect me. You took Null Rod, pick 10. That's maybe the highest, like, specific sideboard hate card taken in this draft. The pick 10 Null Rod is pretty aggressive.
That was specifically from, like, Googling, like, like Hate Bear Canlander and just being like, oh, okay, maybe I'll do this. But
yeah.
Phyrexian Revoker, I took in both drafts because I was
super highly.
I was just
in the second draft.
impressed at how, you know, it just turns off every Mana Rock. It turns off every Planeswalker. It turns off Time Vault. Like, there were just so many games where the opponent was crippled by this 2-drop.
Yeah. So I really like my deck from this first draft because it was like kind of funky. It was like I said, kind of like a Delver style tempo deck. But I also, because of Mystical Tutor specifically, I did have a Terminus in the sideboard, and it was pretty easy to draft enough non-basic lands that against the right deck, I could just Mystical Tutor for Terminus and have a really efficient answer. And the way I won the vast majority of my games was I took pick 38 and pick 39 after taking mostly like tempo-y control cards, a lightning bolt here or there. I took Fire Blast and Price of Progress, and I just ended most of my games basically as a burn deck that was just kind of playing to this inevitability and not like racing you, but like countering your key spells, controlling you for a while, and then eventually killing you with Price of Progress. Which
I was so mad because I took Blood Moon and Mages of the Moon thinking this will lock so many people out. But because of the Moxen and all of the stuff, it didn't. And then I was like, I saw Price of Progress just wrecking people. And I was like, oh, I could have sped up my clock so many turns if I had just done that.
Yeah, Pop was really good. Did anybody even play it in the second Roto draft?
I don't believe so.
Control F. Price. No. Nobody,
did any of the aggro decks play red? Like any of the, I say aggro decks, any of the creature decks play red.
No one took Lightning Bolt.
No,
Lightning Bolt did not go. It wasn't in the top 300. I guess it was even a 9-person draft, right? Or is it 8?
This was the 8, and I put the we actually have links to the card pools on Cube Cobra. Maybe we can put those out if people want to take a look.
Sure.
But in the second draft that we did, there were 10 red cards drafted, including
only 10,
including Mox Ruby.
That's actually really funny because red was good for me in the first draft. Like it was not taken highly early on, and then I felt like, okay, fine, I'll take these really good red cards no one wants, and it worked out. Like my first deck was, I think I went 4-2. Let me check the match records here. Yeah, I went 4-2 in the first one and didn't play my last match because... No, I'm sorry, 4-1. I went 4-1 in one. I didn't get to play against Allison. So that was a good performance for sure. And I think it ended up being actually kind of the deck I described. I just didn't really identify it as a control deck at first because the forces were gone. And I was like, well, now I can't answer things before turn 1 or 2, which is kind of a big problem. But that worked out pretty okay for me. I will say one thing that really stood out is I took Mental Misstep 4th pick. I was like, this card has got to be broken. Like, it's the Vintage card pool. This card is restricted in Vintage. It's banned in Legacy. It, is a free counterspell after I just got, my Force of Wills taken from me. And I did not main deck this card, and I think I sided in 1 or maybe 2 matchups. It just turned out at the end that, like, everybody's got fast mana and was just jumping to the broken part of the curve for the most part. I mean, it was certainly like a Julian I played it against. Julian had all the 1 mana discard spells.
You were the only one to beat
cantrips.
Julian, right?
Yes, though honestly, I didn't deserve it.
Okay. Well, if it makes you feel any better, I would say he didn't deserve to beat me. But
right, so there you go. It comes out in the wash.
No, Julian's a much better player than me, but he turn 0 comboed me out before I had a turn, and I had a turn 1 Trinisphere to play against him, and I'll just take that to my grave, I guess.
I gotta try and remember exactly what happened because it was really notable in our game. I know that it ended with him resolving Tainted Pact, and the card he needed was literally the last card in his library, and he was going through his library exiling the cards and getting like a little bit frustrated as he was doing so, and then he just absentmindedly exiled the last one and then died on his draw step. But it's like, if you had just stopped knowing that the last card was the one you wanted, then you could have won.
Right.
And it wasn't Thassa's Oracle. I forget what it... I think he had the Oracle in hand, and he needed something else because he knew I think he knew I had a Red Blast. I forget exactly what it was because he had like open information because he duressed me a couple times or something. I forget exactly what it was, but I know he knew his last card was what he needed, and he like Tainted Pacted on my end step and then just kind of frustrated and exited his whole library and was like, oops, I guess I lose, but I could have won. And I was like, we can say you won. He took it very seriously. I mean, Julian's going to the Pro Tour, so he was like, no, I made a mistake. I have lost. So, but I didn't deserve that one. He should have gotten that. That was our game 3, basically. In the second full Vintage Roto, I took a very different approach. The first one, frankly, was very stressful for me. I mean, maybe stressful is the wrong word. I invested a lot of time and energy in like paying attention to what everyone was doing, trying to draft the right sideboard cards and hate cards and the right toolbox things. And like, I played a lot of counter magic and interaction. It was like a very thinky deck. And I was not in the mood for that when we started the second one. And I was in the mood to try something that I thought had the potential to be broken that nobody did in the first draft at all, which was Eldrazi. I was like, if I can just take an early crop rotation or, you know, something else to like go get lands I need, I can play Eye of Ugin, which is broken. I mean, playing with that card a little bit, it is just so incredibly broken. I don't know what they were thinking. This is the one that just makes all colorless Eldrazi spells 2 mana less to cast. It does not tap for mana itself, but during Eldrazi Winter, you would just play that on turn 1 and then play like 2 or 3 Eldrazi Mimics because you can use the mana multiple times. It's just a discount. You could just play 6 mana of spells on turn 1 off your normal land drop. Obviously, I couldn't break Singleton, so I couldn't do that, but it was truly messed up. I got that. I got Eldrazi Temple. I got Ancient Tomb and just basically did Eldrazi Stompy, which was really interesting. I realized kind of halfway through the draft, again, I didn't think as hard about this one, that as I started actually putting a full list together, when I was like partway through the draft, I was like, I don't really have enough threats. There's not really enough. We did this before Modern Horizons 3 was legal, importantly, because I think there'd be some cards from that card pool that I want in this deck now, but I was like a little bit short on just like Eldrazi that were worth casting in this meta. Like, you know, Thought-Knot Seer is great, Reality Smasher is great, Endbringer's pretty good, and then after that it's like Eternal Scourge and you play Eldrazi Mimic, and World Breaker ended up being really good for me actually. I played Endless One. All these cards, by the way, I got for free late because I knew nobody else would be able to cast them or want them, which was part of my strategy. I was like, I'm going to take these enablers early, then I can take like sideboard cards super early. When did I take Bajuka Bog? I guess it was pick 30, so not that early. But
do you think you would have liked some clone effects, like a Metamorph for a Phantasmal Image or something like that to up the threat count? And
the thing is, those don't get discounted by all the ramp spells. They I needed things that would turn my lands into soul lands. Otherwise, I'm just
I mean, they only cost 2 or 3, but I didn't know if you were counting on them costing even less than that.
And colorless mana probably too, right?
Yeah, I had a lot. I played green as my other source, but what I ended up doing instead of trying to, I mean, that might have been a perfectly viable route for all I know. Maybe that would have worked. The other thing is some of the Eldrazi have cast triggers, not ETBs, because they're Eldrazi. Though actually, I'm not sure any of the ones I just mentioned do. Like Thought-Knot Seer is an ETB famously, because otherwise it would be so good against counterspells, it'd be disgusting. Reality Smasher doesn't have a cast trigger. Endbringer doesn't have a cast trigger. So no, I guess yeah, maybe the clone effects would have been good, possibly. But instead what I did is I decided to also play a Dark Depths package, because I'm like, I already have crop rotation to go get my ramp lands most of the time, and I'm playing green because I want to play crop rotation, so I'll just also play Dark Depths Thespian Stage, which was, you know, a nice thing to slot in, though I think I only killed somebody with Merit Lage once. It was definitely like the deck's plan B.
Yeah.
And I also took a Strip Mine, Wasteland, Crucible of Worlds, Life from Alome package.
You really buried the lead here.
Yeah, which honestly, I definitely won most of my games just by casting Eldrazi. That was how most of the games were closed out. And I had a couple games where I felt like I should have just won because I turned 1 Black Lotus, Crucible of Worlds, Strip Mine, and then just lost still. Like against James, I did literally that. He played a land on turn 1. I think it was an island, and passed. And on my turn 1, I played Black Lotus, Crucible of Worlds. He didn't counter it. I strip mined his island, and in response, he cast Ancestral Recall. And then I lost the game because he just had infinite lands after that. And it was like, okay, this is only good if I can eventually stop you from casting spells and then get to play more lands. But if I'm literally just playing strip mine every turn, I'm not getting ahead at all.
Yeah, you're playing from behind instead of ahead.
That was, I think, by the way, my most demoralizing game of the whole draft was when you did the turn 1 Lotus Crucible Wasteland. And I was like, okay, I just need to draw some plains or swamps in my deck to get back into it. And I proceeded to draw 5 non-basic lands in a row and no acceleration.
Skill issue. Yeah, even that game, though, was not like, because you had, you know, things like Mana Crypt and stuff in your deck, and you were definitely just like, all I need to do is draw like, I need 1 land to stick for 1 turn, and then I can just play Seasoned Dungeoneer and win, right? Because
yeah, I had White Plume in my hand, so I was like, I just need to draw Mana Crypt or one of my lands that tap for 2 mana. And
Yeah. And so even that, with your bad luck and me having turn 1 Crucible of Worlds lock, was still like, it was a longish game because I'm not developing my board if I'm actually just answering your lands every single turn. So it's not like I am getting ahead at all. It was really interesting that like that was not as good as I expected it to be. It was definitely demoralizing. People did not enjoy it, but it was not like super strong in this context, at least the times it happened. Mostly it was just like, I'm just going to play turn 2 5-drop and turn 3 7-drop and then just attack. And that is how I won most of my games, as it turns out. This deck did a lot worse, though. I went 3-3, didn't get to play my last match against Noria, though. We talked about how you won the second one, Alex. Julian or me kind of won the first one, basically.
Julian won the first one. He and I both had one loss, but my loss was to him.
I had one loss, too.
Oh, do you only have one loss?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Then it sounds like...
And I beat both of you.
Oh, no, you didn't.
I lost to you?
Yeah. So it was a 3-way tie for first?
3-way tie.
Oh, dang.
And we all kiss.
Yeah, I thought my first deck was better than my second deck, but with both of them, I just wanted to disrupt. Like, I just didn't ever want to feel like I wasn't countering my opponent's game plan. And so the first time I noticed that Elite Spellbinder and Anointed Peacekeeper were just so good. And so the second time I drafted Deep Cavern Bat and Tide Howler Sculler and the Turok creature and him to Turok. And so I got some games where the opponent was just like, I played 2 lands and you made me discard 6 cards, and that was it.
Turns out pretty good.
Yeah, and Dark Confidant could have hit Blightsteel, and I still would have won.
So I thought this was a really fun experience, and I would gladly do it again because I think it's so interesting to explore the types of decks you can draft, right? Like, you would have to like really bend over backwards to support Eldrazi in a cube such that you could draft an Eldrazi Stompy deck. And all these like sideboard cards we're talking about, like, do powerful vintage cubes play Meltdown? I don't even know. Like, maybe they do. I actually have no idea. It's a meta that I'm not super aware of, but I don't usually see things like Meltdown or Red Blast in cubes, but they were critical here, like really important to how the thing shook out. So it was a very different experience, I thought, than drafting a powerful vintage cube. Do you think the games were fun?
I like to win, and I have fun. No, I thought they were fascinating. Now, maybe not to do, every week or all the time. And there were some games.
It's a little brain bending.
Yeah, there were some games that just were not games, and that always leads to like a feel bad. But I really enjoyed it. And also like the combination of drafting and playing was great because I had never seen an Eldrazi deck. You were drafting it, and I was just like, is this going to fall on its face completely, or is this going to blow us all out? I have no idea. And also, I need to scramble.
Neither.
Yeah,
it was fine.
And I need to scramble to figure out what I'm going to do about it. Like, that was very fun, where it's like, and for those who do like doing a deep dive into the depths of Scryfall, it's really great.
I want to give a quick shout out to James, the designer of the Brea Cube, who was in the rotisserie drafts with us as well. And his second deck, I literally looked at his pool and I was like, I don't really quite get what's going on here. Then I looked at his built deck and I was like, I still don't really quite. I mean, I get it. Like, it's basically a Thassa's Oracle combo deck with Hermit Druid, but then like just the suite of cards he chose to like support this combo were surprising to me in a lot of contexts and ways. And he ended up with like an Allurin Acererak, just slid in there for fun, which he killed me with in one game. So it was a really interesting deck that like completely different than I've ever like. You could never draft this deck in a cube. So to your point, I think a lot of the fun here is like, here are totally different decks in some cases. If your players are aware of them and see them and draft them, than you would ever get out of any cube draft, which I think is kind of interesting.
I thought you said he had an ass rack in there, and I was about to ask, what the heck was that?
Acererak the Archlich, Aran. The card that was played in Legacy Allurin for 4 days when it was spoiled, and then no more, basically. I don't think. Aaron, what did you think about the actual texture of the games?
Overall, I ended up having... Well, so for the first draft, I thought my deck was going to do terribly. I was just very not confident. I was also drafting it while I was sick, I remember vividly. And I even have a little like sick emoji next to my name on the spreadsheet. I ended up going 2-4 in that first draft, so not a great record, but I had pretty close to a 50% game win rate. I had a lot of really close matches, like a lot of 1-2 losses. And it performed a lot better than I was expecting, and I felt like a lot of the games in the first draft were pretty close, actually. And I didn't feel that as much in the second one. I still had a lot of fun, and I felt more kind of room to explore with that experience. But my impression was that there were a lot more one-sided matches in this one that we did. I don't know if that was the deck configurations or, it could be a lot of different things. But that was my impression. I would definitely do it again. I think this is the kind of thing where it feels overwhelming the first time you do it. And I would recommend, especially if you're someone like me who's thinking about it but doesn't have a lot of background knowledge of Magic's card pool, to try it at least twice and see how it feels. And I felt a lot more confident in the second draft and was able to kind of relax a little, even though the games, I mean, some of them were one-sided in my favor, but I felt like there were, circling back to our match, I think was a good example
Two
of that.
matches, we just did two because it was going so fast.
Where it was just basically Mana Crypt and Initiative versus Eldrazi and Fastlands, and the games were mostly virtually over by turn 2, if not actually over.
Yeah, it was either like you're on the play and you play turn 1 White Plume Adventurer, or I'm on the play and I play turn 1 Thought Knot Seer, or, it was a mess, just swinging back and forth. In one of our games, what was the exact... I know it ended up resulting in a turn 2 World Breaker, destroying your only land, but I forget what I did on turn 1. It involved like...
You had a Lotus. There was a Lotus involved in there, and...
It must have been
2...
Eye of Ugin plus Yavimaya Cradle of Growth, which essentially makes Eye of Ugin produce 3 mana towards your Eldrazi spells. So that's 4 mana total, plus 3 off of the Black Lotus. And I was on the play, and I just was like, I blow up your one land, and then I have a 6/7 in play. Stupid games of Magic. My experience was like the first draft, I was playing like a thinky control deck. Like I said, I had to care about what my opponent was doing and use my counter spells and interaction strategically. And I thought the games were pretty interesting, pound for pound. In the second draft, I was playing a dumb Eldrazi Stompy deck that was like make many mana, attack with big things, and just cast them. And I definitely had a lot less fun in the second draft, which is, entirely my fault for drafting a deck that I wasn't going to have as much fun playing. But I also just felt like one of the costs, I think, of doing this is that there are a lot of Magic cards in Magic's history that are not fun, and they're very powerful. Yeah. And it's like, if you do this, you're just signing up for, assuming everyone's, trying to maximize for winning instead of, having fun. People are going to take the Strip Mines and the Hymn to Turox and the Mind Twists and the cards that are just not fun to play with or against. And you have to do it, right? That's just what this ends up being. So I felt that more in the second draft, where it was like, either I was doing it, like it's not that fun for me, honestly, to Strip Mine lock somebody out. It's like, okay, now we're just not really playing Magic anymore. Or it was being done to me. It's like, okay, I just got, turn 2 Mind Twisted and have no hand anymore. So good job.
Especially when you're doing it over 7 matches versus 3 on like a cube night, then you start to feel that a little bit more. It probably wasn't surprising that a lot of the cards here were from either alpha or more modern sets, but did anything stand out to you, either of you, about the card pools for each draft?
I mean, definitely the lack of green and red. Blue being the top of the heap, not shocking. Black and white being second and third was a little bit interesting, but I suppose that makes sense again, at least from my theory of disruption. Those are the 3 colors that I think disrupt the best. It can just go so many different ways, and I almost wonder if this is like a less stressful roto experience than drafting a cube, because you can just pick your deck and focus on that lane, and then if something gets swiped from you, it is bad, but it's, I think, maybe not as bad as in a cube where it's just like, oh, there's no other of that effect. You might, if you lose out on Swords to Plowshares, you might not be able to get whatever your deck needed. And in this, you're just like, oh, okay, I can look up the top 12 white removal spells and move on to a different one.
Yeah, I think in the second draft, like I said, I tried a lot less hard, but trying a lot less hard for me still means that like I put together a whole list of all the cards that I wanted in order, right? Like at the beginning of the draft. And it was a somewhat realistic list. Like, obviously, if I put together a list of all the cards I wanted, it'd be like all 5 Moxen and Black Lotus, right? It was somewhat realistic, assuming I'd get like 1 piece of power or whatever. And I got everything I wanted except for 2 cards. 2 cards you took from me. You took City of Traders when you didn't have any other soul lands. And I guess that makes sense. You were like, I still want a soul land. And funnily enough, I replaced the City of Traders with Crystal Vein, and I kind of think maybe it ended up being better, because I had Exploration and Crucible of Worlds in my deck, and I had multiple turns where I was like, make 4 mana with Crystal Vein.
I was about to take that literally the turn before you took it, so it was well timed.
The other card you took from me was Tritosphere, which, I mean, this is just my fault, I guess, but I was convinced by the time we got to like pick 10 or 11 that nobody in this draft was going to take Trinisphere because you were the only deck I thought might be interested in it. And you had first picked Mana Crypt, Chrome Mock, Dark Ritual, Vampiric Tutor, Thoughtseize, Orcish Bowmasters, Unmask. And it's like, those cards are all awful with Trinisphere. Except, the ramp, it could be good to get into Trinisphere, assuming you get to play it first. It ended up being good for you, right? Like, I'm just wrong that your deck was not right for Trinisphere.
That point, you got up to Unmask, and at that point, which was pick 7, I was still angling for the Reanimator train.
Yeah.
Based on the theory that you said earlier, which was that people either were gonna prioritize one or two pieces of hate against Reanimator and think they were okay, and then not be able to draw it in time to stop me. That was my premise. And then by the time it got back around to me in round 8, I was thoroughly snaked. And so my next pick 8, was White Plume Adventure. And at that point, I was like, I'm going in on the white hate bears. And so when I kind of drew up my short list for that, Trinisphere was on it. That was the pivot.
From there, you basically only took cards that are good with Trinisphere, right? Like, after pick 8, there's like Thalia only costs 2. I guess that's a little worse with Trinisphere, but it works well alongside it. So that's something. But other than that, it was just like, yeah, you took high-end stuff after that, and we're just taking advantage of the Trinisphere deck. So that's just on me for, like, your first 8 picks were essentially for a different deck, and I didn't recognize that you had, like, changed lanes so dramatically by taking the White Plume Adventurer. Point being, I only missed out on 2 cards, right? I got to draft the exact deck I wanted, which means that I really didn't pay that much attention to what people were doing, because I was like, I have my plan. No one's going to take my Eldrazi from me. I want to make sure I get Chalice of the Void and Strip Mine and Wasteland and these things that are, like, generically good, and that's what I took early. And I didn't start taking Eldrazi until pick 29. I took Thought Knot Seer, which is probably even aggressive. I could have probably waited till later to take it, because who's going to take it realistically?
How was Chalice for you?
Great.
Okay. Because you said Mental Misstep wasn't good, but because the open deck list, you can play it on 2.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, Chalice was fantastic. It is the most thinky of the thinky cards. It was the only thinky card in my whole deck, but the number of times I had to pull up someone's whole deck list and look at it and think really hard about whether I was more worried about the 1 or 2 mana spells and how the game was going to play out definitely required a lot of thought, but it was, I think, extraordinarily powerful. I was really impressed with it, and definitely had multiple games where my opponents were just like, okay, I can't do anything now anymore. So
Did you ever do the pull the ladder up behind you move of play Black Lotus, play Chalice on 0?
I played Chalice on 0 once against...
I guess most people only had, at most, like 2 Moxes, so maybe it's not that great.
Yeah, but other people did have more 0 mana. I think it was actually Patrick, who doesn't have any Moxes, but did have Urza's Bauble, Mishra's Bauble. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I didn't play it on 0 at any point. Another card that really stood out in that deck for me was Blast Zone. Blast Zone was great, which I took as like kind of a catch-all answer in my crop rotation package. The dream I didn't get to live that I really wanted to live was using Thespian Stage to turn it into a copy of Blast Zone so I could then blow up all the 0 mana non-land permanents, all the tokens basically, which Blast Zone is not supposed to be able to do. That never came up. That would have been cool if that had happened, but sad.
One thing that stood out to me as I was kind of looking over the pools was that in the first draft, I noticed that there seemed to be a lot of cards from, in addition to Alpha, Antiquities, the Urza's block, and then in the second... I didn't do a really detailed analysis of this, but then in the second draft, there seemed to be a lot more kind of commander cards, and I was speculating that maybe that's because there were fewer combo decks in the second draft, and maybe leaning on the older card pool to support combo will manifest that way. I don't know what you guys think of that.
Yeah, I don't know. I definitely looked at the first spreadsheet when I planned my second draft and was like, assuming people would do something similar, and then they didn't.
Yeah.
Like, the decks were very different. There was a couple of, there was still, an initiative deck, but it was kind of a different style initiative deck in each pod. Like, the other initiative deck was also playing Force of Wills and stuff. It wasn't just an all-out initiative deck, which I have to say, look, I think playing against the initiative is awful. Not just because it's powerful. People are going to think that I'm just complaining because it's powerful, but I won both of our matches 2-1. Like, I beat it. I still think it sucks to play against. Like, it is up there for me with Strip Mine and Mind Twist, just in terms of, like, things I do not want to play in Magic.
It was kind of a hassle for me to track. I mean, we had, especially in our match, where our match was the only one where the initiative actually changed hands. Mm-hmm. So at that point, we had to, like, stop and figure out the protocol for keeping track of the initiative and the dungeon. And I know a couple times we both did the triggered ability after we drew a card because it kind of reminded me of a Saga, the way we had the card there and we're kind of tracking it, and Sagas usually trigger after your draw step, and so we had to unwind that a couple times. And when it wasn't just me, like when I played against Alex, it was I did the classic turn 1 or turn 2 white plume, and then I just basically kept the initiative the whole time, so it was easier for me to keep track of that way. But in our first draft, I had the initiative, and it didn't strike me as super onerous, but after the end of this draft, I was a little over it, especially when it was changing hands.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that it was a little bit fought over in the first draft, where I had some initiative cards and Allison had some initiative cards. But yeah, I think
you had 5 in your deck in this one. You had crazy. All of them basically, like all the playable ones.
Yeah, I think even vintage cubes now are going away from initiative,
which. I hear people talking about like, oh, we're doing this for power level reasons. I don't think they are. I think they're lying to themselves. I think they're doing it because they also think it sucks. And they envision themselves as like power motivated cube designers. They want to like curate the most powerful cards ever. And they're like, well, this is just too good. But you're playing Black Lotus in a lot of these cubes. What do you mean White Blue Adventure is too good? It just sucks to play with, and you know it.
I had this thought. I think I had a slightly more generous interpretation of this than Andy, which was that my sense recently is that, as you said, Alex, some of these cards are starting to leave cubes. And my interpretation was actually the opposite, that for a while people were trying to play kind of the most at the peaks of power in vintage cubes specifically. And now there's more of a recognition that to have a fun play experience, especially in paper where, you know, like online, the computer's keeping track of the initiative for you. But in paper, you want to curate it a little bit more with an eye towards the player experience. So two sides of the same coin.
Yours is much more generous, and I'm sure both are true. I'm sure there's people out there that are in each camp, right? They're doing it for both reasons. But yeah, I don't know. One of my pet peeves about other resource management games, other like Euro games, right, is that I think a lot of them, when you like actually unpack them at the end of the day, there's not really strategic depth, and they just mask that in a bunch of complexity. It's like the classics for me for this category are like Splendor. I played a game that I hadn't played before called Cascadia recently, which I think is actually a really nice game. Like, it's fun and cool, but it definitely, like, the way that it keeps you from figuring out the right strategy is just making it way too complicated to do so. Like, all the information's face up. You could sit there and take every turn, take 15 minutes, and you could make the correct play if you wanted to, but nobody's going to do that because they're playing casually, and it just doesn't make sense. And there's a certain point where, like, you just hit a cap where you're like, well, I'm not willing to invest the time to, like, figure out what is correct here. And I think that the initiative just pushes the complexity of the game so far, especially in contexts where, like, against you, Aaron, you would play like White Blue Adventure, and I'd be like, okay, Aaron can do one of these many things. And next turn, Aaron can probably take the initiative or, like, you know, proceed through this 2 more times, you know, based on how his deck is constructed. And so what are the different things he could do if he went through 2 more times? And then if I attack back, is Aaron going to block because he doesn't want me to get the initiative? How good is it for me to get the initiative? And what am I going to do if I get it? I have all these other options I'm going to do. And you have to look like 4 turns ahead because you choose these paths and then they don't converge again, which I think is a good thing about the mechanic. Like, it makes it more interesting. Those decisions matter more. But it's also hugely complicated to be like, what do I want to have happen in 4 turns if all these other things go right? And the other thing I really felt in our match specifically was the cards that give the initiative are also complicated in and of themselves. It's not like they just ETB take the initiative and then they're just a creature. They have things to give protection to make creatures unblockable. They have things to increase power and toughness to make racing much more difficult. They have lifelink, like Passageway Seer, which makes racing more difficult. I immediately was like, I could sit here and, like, take out a notepad and figure out what the right thing to do is, but instead I'm just going to make, like, a play based on heuristics and then find out next turn if that was a huge mistake, because I just cannot figure out all of the possible options from this point. And if you want to do that and you're listening at home, great. I think you are in the vanishing minority of Magic players. It's just so complicated.
I think if you want this effect, like, Monarch's just better.
Yeah.
Like, and you know, a lot of people don't like Monarch. I completely understand. But the other Monarch not only is cleaner and easier to understand, it's also, like, more fun to play against and with. Like, it's, you know, you don't lose, you lose to the cards they draw, right? And that doesn't feel as bad as losing to the dungeon that you read, you know, like,
tried to read.
Yeah, exactly. That you maybe understood a little bit. Yeah. Like, you know, no one, usually you don't win having the Monarch with just the Monarch creature on the board, you know, for 3 turns. Like, but you can do that with initiative. Like, you can just take one and ride it home, because I think initiative represents like 8 extra damage, something like that. between the +1/+1 counters and the trap,
life drain
or whatever.
and
Yeah, like it's so much stuff. And there's an argument that Monarch's more powerful. Drawing a card is better than
Oh, I don't think
getting well, I mean, at different steps, getting a land. But
a lot of it comes down to the rate. Like if they printed Monarch cards at the rate of White Plume Adventurer, maybe Monarch would be better. But
good point. There are no 3 cost, that. So yeah, I don't know. I find it much more interesting. I find it much more fun to pass back and forth. You can pass it back and forth without it being a gigantic swing, and yeah, so you just get all the complexity of the board state and are they going to block and are they going to have removal that you have normally. It's just with a little bit higher stakes.
Yeah, and I will give a shout out to Joe, who I know is out there listening. Joe is a known initiative enjoyer, and I think his perspective is probably shared by a lot of people. I'll share the other side of the coin of this, which is that in very powerful cubes that are playing power and broken combos and stuff, it's really hard for combat to matter. It's just not a thing that comes up very often. And the initiative is essentially like the most pushed board impact combat matters mechanic ever. And that part I like about it. That part's cool. It's cool that it allows creatures to just kill you. The fact that it does it through so many layers of remove, and every single creature you play also essentially making a planeswalker token that like takes a bunch of abilities. Just I truly like it was as not fun to play against as things like Mind Twist and the legendary Hall of Fame of just groan inducing magic cards. I felt that way exactly about White Plume Adventurer. Even though I was beating it still sucked.
I did have a good time playing him on turn 1, but because of these roto drafts, I actually rethought the way that I'm going to put my vintage cube back together now that we've completed these. And what I have ended up deciding to do is I'm actually just going to split it into 2 smaller cubes. And one of them, I'm going to try and make an encapsulation of this experience that we had. So when we do have the itch to play Time Vault and the initiative cards and power, we could pull that out. And the other cube is going to get the domain cards and the things that maybe are like a slight power level tier below. Maybe power level is the wrong word, but this one would definitely be more combo oriented. And then
like interactivity level maybe.
And then the kind of still powerful but unpowered version will be playing more on that tempo value axis a la Bun Magic. And I was initially inspired to put my cube together by watching LSV draft on YouTube and so on. But then when I actually got a chance to play Vintage Cube for the first time in paper, it always just feels, especially when you're drafting a 540, it feels so bad to not open power, not open the really busted cards, because especially if you're not playing it online, which I don't play Magic online, you only get to draft a Vintage Cube in paper every so often, right? And so when I personally sit down to play Vintage Cube, I want to make sure I'm opening some of those powerful cards. And I think to ensure that you do that, especially if you want to make it an 8-player cube or a 6-player cube, for a smaller group, then you need to have strategies that will compete at the level of power. And so that's how this experience kind of has informed my cube design philosophy going forward.
I mean, that's one of the things I loved about this draft is the power gets spread out. Magic is random enough, that you don't also need someone having 3 pieces of fast mana and someone having 0. And, this, until you get to 16 drafters, like you all have a chance at doing that. And so everybody having 1 or 2 pieces to me felt a lot better than, sometimes when
Absolutely.
You're drafting a cube. And I know some people have gone the route of, is it Lore Seeker?
Lore Seeker is the one that puts an extra pack into the draft.
Yeah,
this is also a Joe technology, actually.
Okay, yeah, and I think that's really smart. Where it's just
to explain it real quick. So Lore Seeker is a conspiracy card that when you draft it, you open a new booster pack and just put a brand new booster pack into the draft in the same spot. And what Joe does is has a powered cube, but the power is all in the Lore Seeker pack. So that means that basically whenever someone takes the Lore Seeker, they're basically saying, I want first crack at the power, but then the whole table ends up getting basically 2 pieces of the pack because it's all in one place, meaning that you basically get to choose in that spot, which I think is really cool.
Which I think I'm actually going to try with the powered combo version, is even in that version, just to make sure the power gets spread out, because I had the same thought, Alex, that I was debating doing something, either seeding the packs, which maybe sounds like more work now that I'm thinking about it than I want to put in, but I like the Lore Seeker idea as well.
Just got to seed 1 pack that way.
On the point of what this says about cube design, I was really struck by the fact that there are a lot of Cube designers that think they're cultivating an environment with Magic's most powerful cards. And I think this does a really good job of highlighting the fact that if you give 8 players the option to just take the best card for their deck in a given meta, it will actually, in big ways, not resemble a vintage cube, right? Like, people, I think, don't maybe want to accept that actually a collection of the most powerful cards in Magic includes, like, I'm looking at the cards people drafted in these things, like Hallowed Moonlight or Vile Redeemer or Creeping Corrosion or Voltaic Servant or Energy Flux. Cards that, well, were we correct? Maybe not. I mean, we're not, again, the best players in the world, but I'm certain if you, cloned LSV 7 times and put 8 LSVs in a roto draft against each other, they are not going to end up with LSV's Vintage Cube list at the end. They're going to end up with a bunch of cards they otherwise would not consider appropriate Vintage Cube. They're going to end up with 10 red cards or whatever and just be like, that's actually what we all agree is the most powerful, which just further highlights the fact that, like, you cannot compare power level in a vacuum. You cannot compare it across these things.
The second you start adding cards, power level changes. Yeah. And this draft is a perfect example of that. The second you start drafting cards, the power level of one of those cards you just named.
Virtue's Ruin.
Yeah, exactly.
2 and a black sorcery. Destroy all white creatures. That was taken in one of the drafts.
Yeah, it changes.
Yes,
changes greatly. Right. So it's like there's no, obvious, this is what is most powerful. And I don't think anyone is arguing, or anyone who's thought about it is arguing for evaluate every card on its own with no regard to what else is in the cube. And so, I think just knowing that is very helpful to design of like, Inti is a very strong card, but it's not performing in my cube, but it's very strong, so it must be really good. Just knowing that, every single part of your cube is affecting that power level. So,
I'm a little less charitable, I think, to what like a lot of cube designers are doing. I think a lot of people are basically saying this is a good cube card, and what they are taking is a implied or like taking for granted this like context, which is one type of powerful cube that some people make that does not in any way represent like the most powerful things you can do in limited Magic. Again, like, I think if you were actually to do that, you would end up with a cube that was like mostly blue and black cards and some red and some green maybe here and there. It's just that people don't want that, and they don't recognize that what they're doing is making a like conscious design decision that is completely different from like power maxing. They're just choosing to do something else that is to their subjective taste. And then when it comes time to evaluate cards, they're not saying, for the cube that I've made to my taste, this card is good. They're just saying, this card is a cube staple. It's a windmill slam or whatever. But we don't have to... I can stop complaining about that.
We could talk about Caracas if you want.
I mean...
I do have a lot of thoughts about Caracas.
I knew that.
I have a lot of thoughts about it.
Alex, I tried to head him off. I think what this experience drove home for me was how great of a game system Magic is. I mean, we took these game pieces that people might know from a vintage context or, Magic Online, whatever, and combined them in such a different way. And that just impressed me. I need to think more about how I want to articulate that. But it was such a different way than we normally play Magic, and it still worked. And the fact that we just have these pieces here that are public, anyone can go proxy all of the cards that we used if you don't have them already and play this very powerful version of a game. I don't know if that exists elsewhere, and it had me really appreciating the game design system of Magic.
I wonder if it would be an interesting experiment for people to try to do some sort of hybrid model where they're drafting, they're rotor drafting part of their cube or most of their cube, and then there's a wild card section with a little bit of a larger,
like last 10 picks, just go crazy.
Yeah, like I don't know if you could open it up to everything because then the last 10 picks would probably be boring, but it...
Well, it depends on, like, you wouldn't do that if you intentionally excluded initiative from your cube. Then you're just like opening up the floodgates for
or like right. You could say all modern cards, right? Everything that's legal in modern is now open for the last 10 picks, and see what your drafters do with it, and then it might give you ideas of what someone what the most powerful deck is if it has these cards, or what you want to add, what you want to test, what you want to cut.
My thought, when you were saying earlier, you were talking about like the pros and cons of this thing, and I agree. I think the biggest pro is that you get to see some really interesting decks that are just not possible to draft in any cube or the average cube. You have to design a cube around supporting this deck specifically, which means it'd be a very different context for all the other cards in which to exist. That's a huge pro, and I still think the huge con of this is that if you truly are doing full vintage ban list, then you're signing up to play some really miserable cards that I think everybody at Magic R&D would say, like, this is a mistake. It is not a fun game piece. We shouldn't have made it, but oops, we did. So if you're just playing with the full kitchen sink, you just end up playing with them, which you may or may not be into. Some people are sickos and like that, but I think for me it was definitely a detraction on the experience. The natural conclusion from this is, do we make our own ban list for full Vintage Roto?
Or I was going to say, do we try full Legacy Roto?
Well, for the Cube version of this that I'm planning, I mean, of course, as soon as you curate this into a cube, I'm going to be excluding cards that, maybe I won't have Mind Twist, who knows? But I think you could very easily come up with a list of, you just poll the group that you're planning to do this with and say, everyone contribute one card you really don't want to play with, and then that's the list, and then you go from there. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yes, maybe it's like the beginning. Everyone gets like 1 to 3 cards. They just get to hard ban, and then you start drafting. Like the first 3 picks are the bans that everyone's making, and then you draft after that. Maybe it's an interesting way to like cut out a lot of that negative, a lot of that downside of having to play with like kind of miserable cards, and then you get all the fun of getting to build cool and interesting decks.
I also like the idea of, as you said, modern, or if you for whatever reason can't proxy cards, you do like the pauper legal card pool or something to make a budget option, and you actually just order the decks once you're done or something.
Whole
like that.
Collection Roto. You just get all your Magic cards you own, put all the boxes on the table, and say, "Go ahead, sort through it." You get the first pick. You just do it in person.
That's basically how everyone starts playing Magic.
Yeah.
Wow.
Is there an easy way to get all of that online so we can just draft someone's collection online?
Anthony's collection is pretty much entirely digitized,
Okay.
so yes, we could do it with Anthony's collection.
That would be pretty
Most
fun.
people, no, we couldn't do it.
It's like, so Anthony just makes a Scryfall for his collection.
Precisely, yes. I think he did make a couple tools. There was a while where we were discussing having someone design a CubeCon Nega Cube. So take the cubes from CubeCon last year, take all the Magic cards that were legal at the time of the list being locked, but were included in 0 cubes at CubeCon, and what's the best cube you can design from that card pool of the cards that nobody chose to put in their cubes.
That's cool.
And I think Anthony actually made a little bit of tooling to like search through that list, because he was like, I got a spreadsheet here, but it's really hard to just look at a spreadsheet and figure out how you're going to build a cube from it. So I think you might actually have some of that technology. All right, let's close on this. If we were to do, you get to ban 3 cards first, then we're going to do a full Vintage Roto. I want to know what everyone's 3 bans are. I'll go first, save the best for last. I think the 3 least fun cards for me in this context, Strip Mine I think has got to go. I think that card is a mistake. Really not fun. It just can turn any game into a non-game, regardless of people's deck construction. It has that potential at all times. I would take Mind Twist too. Similar reasons. I think the randomness is not fun. That one at least has a little bit of to defend it in that like you have to really work to build a good Mind Twist deck. It's not like it's free.
Yeah, was anybody running wild with Mind Twist?
I had it
Aaron,
in my
you had
deck.
it in the second draft.
Okay.
How was it for you?
I mean, when I could cast it I'm pretty sure I cast it against you, Alex, and made you discard like your whole hand.
Okay.
At some point. I guess the memory was so bad that it's.
No. I mean, I play the online cube and it's in there and it's fine. But
I didn't draw it that much, and I imagine it's a lot less oppressive again in a 540 where you're not even playing online. You're not playing people in the same pod that you draft with, right?
Not generally.
Yeah. So I mean, you're probably just going to see it a lot less. But again, this is actually one of the cards I'm thinking about excluding from the cube version of this, is just for that reason.
Well, it's sort of like you have to get to 4 mana for it to be better than a Hymn to Turok, and like there's a lot of busted stuff at 4 mana.
All right, I'm also ban Hymn to Turok. Hymn to Turok, Strip Mine, and Mind Twist are the 3 that I would cut on just not being fun. Aaron, what are your 3?
Alex, if you want to go, I feel like I need to take a look at the lists here.
Yeah, my stuff is definitely impacted by me as a player because it's all combo stuff.
That's totally fine.
Yeah, like
That's why I'm
Thassa's
asking you.
Oracle, like Demonic Consultation.
I think if you ban Thassa's Oracle, you've basically just effectively banned Demonic Consultation at the same time.
Probably don't need that one. Clearly, I have some PTSD issues on those 2 cards. White Plume Adventurer, 3 mana to get the initiative. Like, put everybody at 4. right? I think it's the only 3 mana one, right?
Believe so, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like put everybody at 4. I might be good to start there. The other thing is I do think it would be interesting to ban Black Lotus, Soul Ring, and Mana Crypt, and just be like, okay, so Moxes.
Yeah.
Let's go with Moxes. You can ramp. That feels a little bit, even though there's an argument that they're just as powerful sometimes. So
Yeah, I like that idea of banning the cards that put you ahead by 2 mana rather than just putting you ahead by 1 or 3 in the case of Black Lotus. Strip Mine was the first one that popped into my mind.
yeah.
But that was partially based on my I think colored by my experience against Andy. But
What do you think about just banning Crucible instead?
I mean, the problem is that there's so much
yeah.
there's so much redundancy for Crucible.
Yeah.
Like Raman Excavator is like, I actually would have been better in those contexts where I was doing it, because I actually would have had a clock while I was also reminding you instead of just having a dumb artifact there.
Yeah.
But you got Life from Loam, you got Excavator, you got other things to do. So I think it'd be hard to actually fully stop that.
I don't even think I'm actually that opposed to Strip Mine or the Initiative in theory. The games that I think I enjoy the least are where it's over on turn 0, and the only time I think I saw that happen was against you, Alex, in the first draft. So I mean, I know like Julian also got me with the Grindstone Painter's Servant combo, very easy to interact with, and I just couldn't, but he assembled it on the first turn. So I was trying to think of cards. Again, this is where my lack of knowledge of the card pool is coming in, but I'm trying to think of cards where you could, if you have access to Lotus and Mana Crypt, you play them both on turn 1 and win the game.
Vault Key.
Yeah, that's a big one.
So I think those would probably be my candidates, the kind of turn 0 win cards. I think. Because then it's like,
you could just get rid of the ramp and just make it so it could never happen on turn 1. If you cut the really fast ramp.
I think it would be one or the other. Like, it would be either going the route that Alex suggested, or which, I mean, that involves banning fewer cards and then leaving more more options open in terms of deck building. So the more I think about it, the more I'm kind of coming around to the ban Lotus, Soul Ring, Mana Crypts camp and seeing what would happen. So I think those are the 3 I would pick.
It's kind of funny to think about doing that in a play group where like everyone knows each other and plays together a lot, and like my first 2 bans are broken cards, and then I'm also just gonna ban Kess from Allison. That's right, Kess. You can't play Kess, Allison. What are you gonna do now?
Yeah, I did think about like Oko and Menskimbu, and I was like, the deck that played them wasn't even that good the first time around. But
no, that's my answer.
Yeah, okay.
I think Oko. I find both. Again, I don't have very strong opinions about cards in general, so it's hard for me to get worked up about them. And
Great
luckily,
person
Andy's
to have
here.
on a podcast.
Luckily, Andy's
Great
here to do that for us.
I don't really have about things.
Yeah.
Everything's fine.
so ban Caracas is what you're saying. Caracas was absolutely not busted in this type of draft.
I have so many other things to get fired up about.
Yes.
But I think I like banning the super fast mana and seeing how that would shake things out. I'm intrigued by that idea.
Yeah, just ramp by 1. That's for 0. That's plenty busted.
Just a quick note, I think none of us were drawn to banning any tutors, which is interesting. I have no problem with people playing tutors. I think it's kind of cool because you can do different things with it. So just noticing that.
Learning all the tutors was really cool. Learning literally all the lands was really cool. Seeing how deep how deep people went on lands.
I had a funny little. I played Living Wish as my 45th pick in my second Roto deck because I was like, well, I'm gonna put Ulamog Hunger in my sideboard because I'm not gonna get to 10 mana. Even 10 mana with this deck in the average game. But if it goes super long and I draw Living Wish, I'll have a Ulamog in the sideboard, which seems good. I also put a Scavenging Ooze in the sideboard for Living Wish, which I brought in the matchups where it was important. But then I also just had a couple lands that were floating around, like, Bojuka Bog, Caracas, Blast Zone, that kind of stuff. Maze of Ith was something I brought in a couple times that just... Maze of Ith is awesome just to play against. that's another candidate. Anyway, we can't keep going on. We've been here for a little while. We started late because of my stupid car problems, so... yeah, we're going to call it there. Thanks for doing this, guys. This was a lot of fun.
I had a blast.
Love the full Vintage Roto. I'm excited to do the next one. Maybe we start with... Honestly, it was way harder for me to give 3 than I thought it was going to be. Maybe we start with just everyone gets 1 ban, Everyone gets to ban 1 card, and then we just go and see what happens from there.
Face down, and then we all flip, or...
No, I genuinely think...
In a row?
I genuinely think you do it in the pick order. You just make the first row. Whoever's first, you ban a card, and then we just go from there. Quickly before we end, we are doing our book club coming up soon, so if you want to join in, buy a copy of Frank Lance's book, The Beauty of Games. I will put it in the show notes, and we're going to be recording an episode about that in a few weeks here probably, so get that, read it, and you can follow along. And our surveys are open for Modern Horizons 3 and Modern Horizons 3 Commander, so definitely get your responses in for that. I still think the set is really sick and has cards for pretty much every cube, so go tell us which ones are for your cube. All right, now we're actually done. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by Aaron, Alex, and I, the 3 A's, thinking really hard about Magic cards and then speaking into microphones about it. Thanks a lot, guys. This was great.
Thank you.
It's a lot of fun.
Huge portion of our play group has a name that begins with A.
Yes. So there's the 3 of us, Anthony. We have multiple
We have
Alexes.
3 Alexes.
So that's 7. And I'm sure we could go
Allison.
Allison, yeah.
Atric.
We could fill
Atric.
Atric Pay. We could fill an entire draft pod with people whose names start with A.
New goal before the end of the summer.